I would like to discuss Haberler's model once again from where I concluded. I've drawn the diagram again to give you more clarity and more understanding of this. Now basically what I'm saying, let's look at this diagram here, which is for country A, and this is of course for country B. Now I've just reversed it for getting the understanding more clearer. If you look at for country A, the production possibility frontier is given by, let's say, ZW. But of course, I'm trying to show that country A now has an increased preference towards good X, in which it has a comparative advantage. So it's good X. Whereas for country B, I've given the production possibility curve, let's call it Z1W1, Z1W1, to give it more clarity and understanding that this is the production possibility frontier as far as country B is concerned, Z1W1. Now supposing we have a scenario where a country today, suppose in X, initial equilibrium was at point C. And the initial equilibrium is arrived at where the domestic price ratio, now this line, this black line here, the domestic price ratio is tangent to the PPF. In other words, the domestic price ratio is tangent to PPF ZW. That's the equilibrium. That's the equilibrium when you have a production possibility frontier and a price ratio which shows the relative prices of two goods, X and Y. Now what happens is now, for case of country B, the equilibrium is given by point D, where the relative price ratio, let's call this B, B1. And in this case, let's call it A, A1. So here it's A, A1, this is at B, B1, where B, B1 is tangent to the production possibility frontier, Z1, W1. B, B1 is tangent. So these are the two tangency conditions where you have the equilibrium. So in country A, the equilibrium, the way it is in point C, and for country B, the equilibrium point is at point D. Now what happens is, trade commences between the two nations. Now, after trade. Now, after trade, what next? After trade, what next? Well, what happens after trade is that the new international price ratio is determined. We have the new international price ratio. Let's call it PP dash. I'll just name it here. PP dash, that's given in the dashed line, PP dash, again here also PP dash, and PP dash quite clearly is a measure which tells you that the international price ratio, this is parallel to this but tangent to production frontier here at D1 and tangent to production frontier here at C1. So you're moving from C to C1 and from D to D1 in case of country B. Now what do we see here? Well, if you look at country A, now let's erode country B. Suppose that with trade, country A moves from an equilibrium from C to C1, as I explained. Now what happens is, earlier the production consumption was YOXO before trade. Before trade, it was Y0, X0. Now after trade, it is Y1, X1. Now how do we show the gains from trade? Well, the new equilibrium C1 says Y1 of Y and X1 of X. But when you draw this price line and when you draw this dotted line extended to join it here, we get this portion. And typically what we see here is that this quantity XO, is exported by country A. Country A exports X0, X1. And in return imports what I call the LCM. The LCM is what it imports. Because if you see at point C1, it is already, what it wants to consume is Y1. And what it wants to produce and consume before trade is X1. But after trade, it produces till XO, that's fair enough. The extra production it exports, and in return, it imports more of Y. So this is what I call the gains from trade. Because if you look at this dashed line, the big dashed line, this is the surplus which it exports, and it's already in this swing where it's consuming this much of commodity Y, but this additional commodity of Y which it consumes is imported. So this is what I call the gains from trade, where country A imports a higher quantity of good Y. Now let's look at country B. When it moves from a new equilibrium from D to D dash, we see the equilibrium is X3 and Y3. Now what happens at X3, Y3? Well, what happens here is that it consumes less of X3, obviously, less of X, and produces more of Y. And this surplus, what I've mentioned, is exported away to country A. So country A imports X, country B exports X. Country A exports, now country A exports good X and country B imports good X. Whereas country A imports good Y and country B exports good Y. So this is what country B is exporting to country A, which it imports, and country A exports this X to country B, which it imports. And the total gains from trade is given by this line called QDP1. I repeat, QDP1. Because if you look at this equilibrium, once again, we will see this graph. Let me draw a thicker line here. The thicker line says this is what the equilibrium is shifted from D to D1, and obviously this extra amount is exported away, and it was at this point. So since it's consuming only this X3, what happens is the extra amount that it imports is given by QDP1 from country A. So this is what I call the gains from trade. Earlier the equilibrium was Y2, X2, now it is Y3, X3. Now X3 it always has, that's perfectly okay, but the extra amount, Y2, Y3, is what it exports in exchange for higher imports of good X from country A. So this is what I mean by Haberler's model, which gives a clear indication that how nations having different shapes of production possibility frontiers and opportunity cost structures would tend to produce more of a certain good, and which it specializes in production and exports the same to another country. So now this is a comparative advantage production possibility curve, which it shows the country has a tendency of producing X, but it just shows how the gains of trade materialize and the shapes of production possibility curves and the international price ratios and the opportunity cost structure. The shape of production possibility frontier sets the platform for differential opportunity cost structure. Here the opportunity cost structure, and here we have a different opportunity cost structure depending on the production possibility frontier. Country A exports X, country B exports Y. That's it, ladies and gentlemen, for Haberler's theory of international trade. And now we will move on to the next model called the J.S. Mill model of reciprocal demand. Now you have the J.S. Mill. Mill was a famous economist, and he called his model the reciprocal demand model, the reciprocal demand theory, where demand is reciprocal between the two countries and two commodities. Again, almost similar assumptions. You have country A and country B, and two goods X and two goods here X and Y and X and Y. More or less similar assumptions of that of what Haberler and the rest of the other trade theorists had mainly in mind. But J.S. Mill is basically, the theory of reciprocal demand is basically an improvement of Ricardo's theory. It's an improvement of Ricardo theory. It's an improvement over Ricardo. And the improvement over Ricardo says that Ricardo says a country would specialize and export that commodity in which it has a comparative advantage. But Ricardo doesn't specify the terms of trade, or what I call the ratio of exchange of goods across countries. Ricardo doesn't mention the terms of trade and the ratio or the rate of exchange of goods across country, the equilibrium. So this is what I call, this is where Mill really helps in his equilibrium. It defines the equilibrium terms of trade or the equilibrium ratio of exchange of goods across countries. And now let's take a simple example what Mill is saying in the concept of reciprocal demand. Suppose we have two countries. Let's take here Germany and let's take here Britain, UK. Now both are producing two goods. One is called linen and cloth. And if you look at the total man hours involved, and if you have a look at this, the comparative advantage theory says that Germany has a comparative advantage over linen, whereas Britain has a comparative advantage in cloth as compared to linen. Now how do we do that? Well, the logic is very simple. For every 6 units of linen produced in Britain, Germany produces 10. So it's very, very clear that, and for every 8 which Britain produces of cloth, Germany produces 10 of cloth. So if you do the ratios like 10 by 6 or 10 by 8, typically we know 5 by 4 is greater than 5 by 3. This ratio is 5 by 3 and this ratio is 5 by 4. But I would like to analyze this in a slightly different perspective. Sorry, 5 by 3 is greater than 5 by 4. Now, if you look at the case of cloth as far as Britain is concerned, now at least it's producing 8 units as compared to 6 for linen. So obviously, if you look at the ratio 8 by 10 and 6 by 10, typically it is a case where 4/5 is greater than 3/5. So Britain has an advantage in cloth and Germany has an advantage in the case of linen comparatively. Again, please understand, comparative advantage. So though Germany has an absolute advantage 10-10 over Britain in both linen and cloth, it produces more. 10-10 stands for units produced with the same man hours involved. Since it produces more, it has an absolute advantage, but Ricardo said it has a comparative advantage in linen as compared to cloth. It has a comparative advantage in linen as compared to cloth. As compared to cloth, Britain has a comparatively less disadvantage as compared to linen. Now this is the basic idea, but Ricardo doesn't says the terms of trade or the ratio of exchange. And this is where J.S. Mill in this concept of reciprocal demand found a solution. Now if you look at the domestic terms of trade, the domestic terms of trade or the domestic cost ratio in the case of Germany is 10 by 10, which is equal to 1:1. Whereas in the case of Britain, the 6:8, it's a case of something like almost 1:1.33. So this is what I call the domestic cost ratios. Now, J.S. Mill outlines that there are 3 possible solutions, point A, point B, and point C. 3 possible solutions. The first solution is that a possible terms of trade will lie between 1:1, 1.33. No matter what it is, domestic cost ratios, it will lie between this. 1:1 or 1:1.33. It will lie between this. A possible terms of trade after trade. Now this is after trade. Before trade we are given something. This is what happens after trade. And the actual terms of trade will depend on the intensity and elasticity of demand. And a stable terms of trade is where value of exports is equal to value of imports. Very, very important, these 3 points. I repeat, a possible terms of trade lies between the domestic cost ratios, what is given earlier. The actual terms of trade, what it actually will be, depends on the intensity and the elasticity of demand, or the strength of demand. And thirdly, as equilibrium stable terms of trade is where it will be between that point where value of exports is equal to value of imports. In other words, Mill says that trade will take place at prices where the country's export earnings is sufficient to pay for the import. So export-import equilibrium. So trade will take place at that price, stable term of trade, at that price where export is equal to import. We are given the domestic cost ratios. We are looking at an actual terms of trade depending on elasticity of demand, and the stable terms of trade is where the value of export is equal to value of imports. And this constitutes the basis of trade. Now, going by this, let's take a small example as regards the intensity of demand and the gains from trade. Now, suppose Germany has a very intense demand for cloth. Germany has a very intense demand for cloth. So, it demands cloth from Britain in exchange for its linen. As I told you, Germany will export linen, Britain will export cloth, and Germany will import the cloth. Now, suppose Germany's strength of demand for cloth increases dramatically. In that case, the terms of trade could be 1:1, which means for every 1 import of cloth from Britain, it gives away 1 linen. The maximum it can give away is 1 unit of linen, because the intensity of demand for cloth is very high. Now, suppose the intensity of demand for cloth in Germany is less than what it was earlier. If the intensity of demand was less, then it would get 1.33 of cloth in exchange for 1 unit of linen. In other words, it's exporting 1 unit of linen under both cases. But when demand for cloth is intense, which means highly inelastic demand, when the demand for cloth is intense, which is highly inelastic demand, it can only import 1 unit of cloth. But when the intensity of demand is less, which means highly elastic demand, then it can import 1.33 of cloth. And typically, the gains from trade is much higher. So the gains from trade is much higher, which depends on when there is less intense demand or demand is more elastic. Because elastic demand means even a small change in price causes a dramatic change in quantity demanded. And that's what it is. If it's not very intense, if it's highly elastic demand, in that case, even for 1 unit of linen, you get more of cloth. So that's what it stands for. But now I will take you, this is principally an example which shows the gains from trade, but also I would like to elaborate by using another concept called the Marshall's offer curve. And by using Marshall's offer curve, I would like to explain the gains from trade. Now, the Marshall's offer curve looks like this. For example, if you have cloth for UK and you have linen for Germany. Germany is linen, UK is cloth. And you derive the offer curves. And this is what I call the equilibrium terms of trade, where UK exports, say, OC of cloth in exchange for OL of linen. Now, the offer curves of 2 countries. Now, let's call this let's call this for Britain. Let's call this OB, and let's call it OG in the case of Germany. So OB is the offer curve of Britain, and OG is the offer curve for Germany. Offer curve means what is the quantity of cloth which UK is willing to offer for exports in exchange of imports of linen from Germany. Similarly, offer curve, OG is offer curve for Germany. It says what quantity of linen Germany is willing to offer to Britain in exchange of how much unit of clothes Britain is willing to provide Germany. So these are the two offer curves, and the equilibrium is where? At point, let's say E. E is the equilibrium terms of trade, where the offer curves intersect. So this is what I call the concept of Marshall's offer curve. This is the concept of Marshall's offer curve. Marshall is another famous economist who explained the concept of reciprocal demand through offer curves. Offer curves basically suggests the production and export of goods by a country in exchange of import of goods from another country. So the concept of reciprocal demand suggests that the quantity of imports demanded by a country in terms of quantity which is willing to give up in exchange. In other words, you're importing a certain quantity from a country in exchange for goods which you're sacrificing, which you're exporting. So the quantity of goods imported by imports from another country, as long as the country is able to pay for it, and pay for the same through exports. That's called the concept of reciprocity of demand. You export and import such that the value of exports is equal to the value of imports, and this is where the equilibrium charges, where the offer curves intersect. Now, I've already shown the conditions of three possible conditions, which shows the gains from trade, and the gains from trade appear from the degree of intensity of demand. Now we will look at another final diagram to say, how do we, using the Marshall's offer curve, how do we decide on the gains from trade? If you are given something like this, like you're given for cloth, and you're given for linen, for Germany and Britain. Now, given the offer curve like this, the equilibrium, as I've already discussed, is at point E, where the offer curve intersects. So this is the terms of trade. You join this. Let's call this OE. OE is the equilibrium terms of trade by which trade takes place across two countries. And you have your offer curve which says OG and OB. Now suppose sorry, let's call this OL, and let's call this OS, and let's put a dotted line here to say we call this OT. Let's put the dots here, OSTMEN. Let's pull the dots. Let's only look at the dots now. Now, what is OL? OL is the domestic cost ratio for Germany, or the domestic price ratio. The ratio of prices of goods, linen versus cloth, as far as OL is concerned. This is for Germany. And what is OS? OS is the domestic price ratio for Britain. As quite clearly you can understand that from these two diagrams, Germany has an advantage in linen and Britain has an advantage in terms of cloth. Now, the terms of trade equilibrium is at point E. Now, suppose we look at this point here. We look at this point here. Britain is exporting OT of cloth. Britain is exporting. And it is now importing. Earlier the case was empty before trade. But after trade, it is EMT. So EM is the gains from trade. Because without trade, this was the equilibrium, OT and MT. But now, after trade, it is OT and ET. And here, EM is the gains from trade. I'll just mark it here. EM is the gains from trade, the additional quantity which is able to import, additional of linen which is importing. This is the gains from trade. Similarly, now for Germany, it is importing OT of cloth. It is importing OT of cloth. But given this, the equilibrium point, the gains from trade is the point which I'm trying to elaborate here is NE. NE is the gains from trade for Germany. Because it's exporting less than what it needs to do. For the same imports, it is exporting less. So NE is the gains from trade for Germany, and EM is the gains from trade for Britain. For Britain, you're importing less, which I've shown, and for Germany, you're exporting less. That's the way I've shown it, the gains from trade. So these are the two concepts of trade theories, which is an improvement of Ricardo. So to summarize, I can say Haberler is a case of differences in opportunity cost structures in the shape of the production possibility frontier, which determines the basis for trade. It's the opportunity cost differentials which forms the basis of trade. Whereas for J.S. Mill, the theory of reciprocal demand, the reciprocity of demand in exchange for two goods between countries, the equilibrium terms of trade and the equilibrium rate of exchange is what is determined, and that takes place where the offer curves intersect. And it actually happens at a point of time where the value of exports is equal to the value of imports. And the actual terms of trade is depending on the intensity, strength, and elasticity of demand. And on the basis, I showed you the numerical example, you can decide on the gains from trade. That's the actual terms of trade. And over time, there's a stable terms of trade, or what we call a near equilibrium terms of trade, where the value of exports is enough to pay for or finance the total value of imports. That's where the equilibrium conditions are reached. And this is the gains from trade, very, very interesting here, as you see different two domestic cost ratios, but now the terms of trade have changed because of the offer curves intersecting, and this is where trade takes place. The value of export is equal to imports, and you see how the respective nations gain. For the case of Britain, it's a clear gain because he's able to actually export that and get more of linen. And in this case, for Germany, I've shown that for the same quantity of cloth, he's exporting less of linen. So it's obviously a potential gain without a doubt. Right. So ladies and gentlemen, this is about the theory of trade. I would now talk about a few on the assumptions here. The assumptions made under J.S. Mill's theory, or even the theory under Haberler of opportunity cost differential concept. The theories both assume that there are two countries, A and B. There are two goods, X and Y. Technology is given and is constant, doesn't change over time. And very importantly, there is perfect competition in all markets. and there is mobility of labor within the region but not between countries. Between countries, labor is immobile. And trade takes place in terms of price, where import is equal to exports. In the case of JS Mill, the reciprocal demand. Very importantly, both trade theories assume that there's full employment in both markets. Now, these assumptions have been challenged. Now, what I'm saying is, please understand, we're not trying to say these are the perfect and the most rational and the most realistic models of international trade. But these economists are making improvements on the concept of absolute and comparative. And somehow Mill is very accepted because they say, at what are the terms of trade? Terms of trade is the international price ratios of trade. At what prices are goods exchanged across countries? What is the equilibrium terms of trade where at what price ratios are goods bought and sold across countries? That is what Mill is saying, and it of course depends on the offer curve intersection points after trade takes place. And for the case of Haberlas says, yes, it is cost differential, but not the labor cost, the opportunity cost differential. It's again a concept of comparative advantage, but improving upon it by showing how differences in opportunity cost leads to trade because of different price ratios. Similarly, in the case of JS Mill, it is at relative prices trade takes place where value of export is equal to imports. So these are the two most important and profound theories. And we will now move on to the next and the last theory that I want to discuss here. Is called the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade. I repeat, it is the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade. Thank you very much.